Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval universities, and some of you will be, oh my god, Schwerpunkt, you made so many videos about medieval universities, please not, these are the boring ones. Well, they're not really the boring ones, even though I agree in the fact that if I had to choose, I would do something else. Just, they're objectively not, in the sense that whenever I pick these topics randomly, as you know, I always try to, I always hope there is something kind of spicier, especially about warfare and something, but I realized over time that not just, first of all, these videos are usually watched, and sometimes even more than the others, and that of course it's important to diversify, etc., but that there is always something to it, some aspect, a cut, a perspective, a dimension that is worth looking at. And today's video is different, in fact, from the others that I made about medieval universities in general. There is a similar one that is about probably the violence and pastime of medieval university students that gets somehow closer to this. But this is probably a different one conceptually, that is to say, why would in these times, considering that universities in Europe proper begin fundamentally at the end of the 11th century, and they spread still in times that were not fully, for example, that didn't have much of a fully back on track monetary economy, where communications were difficult, when in fact life was pretty uncertain, even just given the political fragmentation, the wars, the heresies. But why would these young men would fundamentally travel across Europe, and sometimes, as we'll see now, also from university to university, because they wouldn't just study in one sometimes only, but they would move all across Europe for, essentially, what did make them do that, right? So a historian of economics would say, first of all, well, yeah, there was something remunerative about it. Yes, of course, but it's not entirely the thing, at least not only. As we will see, it did constitute, of course, an important element of it, because, of course, if you were a doctor, if you had a specific university, let's say, curriculum, you could definitely access certain offices mostly in the administration, right, in this nascent feudal monarchies that had all their own, starting to have their own substantial apparatus later on. Also, unsurprisingly, it's the booming of the universities in the 13th and the consolidation in the 14th. You have probably a real pre-modern bureaucracy, in fact, at its highest. And actually modern bureaucracy being born there, telling you the truth, and mostly from these university studies. So you know that we approach the topic from either the sense of organization / lifestyle, and probably medieval law, which was the most important discipline, telling you the truth, right? The most important ones were theology and law, but law would essentially expand further, exactly because of these subtle developments of European polities, monarchies mostly, city-states, etc., in the late Middle Ages. And we will naturally keep discussing that at some other point. Today, we'll really look at this individual human factor, right? Not much saying, of course, what could be all the reasons that would bring a medieval person whose mindset, of course, is practically impossible to reconstruct, and that we will never fully know to its extent, but that would push them, right? We think would trigger this interest, what were their questions, the unknowns that were many, right? It was a gamble in many ways, and what was, of course, also the reward of this whole thing, and much of that laid also in the journey, right? Because I think it's an actual topic, because sometimes we get, today, we're very highly educated and all specialized, whatever, but we still have difficulties to find jobs, and this is how the world goes in many ways, and it goes like that because, of course, we think the world is in a way, then it goes in another. So we're constantly readapting, right? Catching up with time and culture and civilization. And there are some ideas behind this, right? It's not really a passive adaptation, but we of course want to make our own thing within it. So that would be also an especially interesting aspect to observe. In any case, given that we have already, again, I have a medieval university playlist. If you're interested in this stuff, we've seen how, when, and why medieval universities were born, right? And at this point, we just ask ourselves, which were, in fact, the end motives that pushed all these young men to leave, right? Sometimes for good, from their originary areas, and to go to far away universities to learn, by the way, subjects that were objectively very difficult and also formal, such as law, right? Consider that one requirement in order to become a doctor in law was to practically learn by heart the entire Roman law. Consider these people had the same social status of knights. They were literally knighted, so they were just like knights in terms of social prestige. Naturally, there was an enormous request of this learned men for, as we've seen, the administration, but not only, because through law you could, in a sense, make politics itself. There were different philosophies. We've seen common law, civil law, canon law. They all were actually coexisting and, in a sense, cooperating, but they were also expanding towards different political directions. So there are many political theories behind, eventually, the experience. It was, while, again, pretty much grounded on a very specific and unspeakably large amount of written information that makes our contemporary university effort look, objectively as it is, ridiculous, even in the top institutes in the world. The possibility of still characterizing, customizing, personalizing what you would, in fact, come up with the analysis of these texts that were complicated. There were institutions, broader. I mean, they had mostly this task of adapting different juridical systems that existed at the same time already in quite, again, different, in fact, manifestations. Let's be generic about this, to real life. This is why, to make long story short, universities were born in Europe. Mainly, there were people who needed to be taught law because they needed to make contracts, to expand jurisdictions, to have all a series of juridical notions that would have been otherwise unknown. That is to say, now we live essentially in a world where we know what the law is, right? That is enforced whether we like it or not, and we can study it, yes, but we have the certainty of what it is, and that there is an institution that is having it hopefully respected, and to a degree that, in spite of some kind of chaotic realities, of course, is unspeakingly crystallized compared to anything they had at the time, even properly in the application, the coercive capabilities of the state, and so on. At the time, there wasn't such a thing, right? What you said as a lawyer was fundamentally also what law could become, de facto, and that's again why polities needed these people, because as scholars, but not only, just as notaries, as other legal experts, they could make things flow in a much smoother way, both, say, economically, of course, contractually, etc., but also politically, right? They were building properly political theory, and in a world where there wasn't fundamentally the state that we know today, and they started building it at the time and taking Western civilization to unprecedented places. Now, in any case, the question remains, that is to say, what did bring these young people to go to, say, Bologna or Paris or Salamanca, right? From faraway places, from hundreds or even thousands of kilometers of distance. Well, this change, naturally, we will see it hopefully in some other detail. There is, this topic is immense, right? So it's obvious that by the end of the Middle Ages, if you wanted to study at university, you had to travel much less because there were many more universities, right? Still were, the oldest, the largest ones were still the most prestigious, but at the same time, local polities had adequated themselves also with local studia and so on. But in the beginning, it was really also, again, an adventure to move across Europe in the first place. So some have given this answer, which of course depends also on the milieu that we're looking at, right? That would be the cultural restlessness that had, as a sort of contagion, struck during the 11th century many young clergymen that were willing to go pretty far away from where, though? From their monasteries, from their cathedrals, to essentially witness, to attend the lessons of some famous master, right, and earning the name, thus the non-positive name, the malicious name of clerici vagantes, which in Latin means, the wandering clergyman, right? So this explanation, first of all, as you understand, has not much just to do with university per se, because there were theological studia, but as we've seen, the boom was mostly in a lay dimension. The university is born in a lay world, right, of educated, properly literate laymen living in context of, say, communal development of, again, lay culture mostly. And it is true, however, that there were many clergymen who were also, moving for this reason. At the beginning, say, during the 11th century, there weren't even universities yet. So as we've seen, the role was performed by other schools that were mostly, basically all within at least the most important ones, within the ecclesiastical education. So much so that mostly the schools laid in the cathedral chapter that had already began to make, we've seen it in the videos about the investitures controversy, use of educated laymen and lawyers, in fact, that at some point began from these environments too, having mostly worked for bishops, etc. And ecclesiastical administration was quite advanced. We've seen recently just the Ottonian government in Italy did think of the bishop counts, the idea that the bishops had basically been conferred by the emperors properly with public authority. So in the lay world, not just in the secular ecclesiastical one, unsurprisingly, the first universities were born exactly in this context, and for, again, strictly administrative reasons, right? But so the clergy dimension was somehow overlapping, because there were clergymen that were needing necessarily to cope also with lay law. It's the contrast we've seen now. We were reminded just now between the papacy and the empire, the fact that the Holy Roman Emperors think about the Constitutio Habita, of the Authentica Habita of Barossa, that was granted to the Bolognese student for what? For reviving Roman law. So essentially the same thing that the Byzantines had built upon Caesaropapism, the idea that the emperor could fundamentally appoint the bishops in whichever way he wanted, just properly from an ecclesiastical point of view, which of course in the West was never done, right? There was a double investiture, and there was always a split division, in fact, at least, by that point, between the papacy and the empire, because the church was autonomous from any earthly authority, right? And this is a big deal, right, for Western civilization, because we think, state and church were divided, say, pretty late in times when they were always divided, right, since the Gospels, right? So it's a misconception, right? Exchanging secular with lay, let's say, emancipation with anti-clericalism, all these kind of things. Unfortunately, we do live in a world that still has issues with this thing. And it's obvious from the other side that there was a church that was mostly developing. We have seen it with the Decretum Gratiani, for example, its own canon law that it was systematizing it better because the canons were already there, but nobody had created an organic corpus. You realize all these pretty darn advanced, because this was the most advanced juridical development was being carried out, I presume in the world at the time, for sure in Europe and the Mediterranean, there is no doubt, and it was naturally also looking at what the lay institutions, categories were doing. Equally, the emperors were looking at what canon law was doing from the hell of the minds that were shared, were living in that world, which the papacy and the empire overlapped at different levels and or dimensions, to say better, and thus were expression of a same culture. So the homogeneity of this was also striking. Regarding the Clerici Vagantes, a French monk of the 12th century, so when actually the first universities had already been born, could write with a certain bitterness that these wandering clergymen were essentially habituated now to wander the world, to visit all the cities, until the too much knowledge makes them become crazy, right? Because they run to Paris for the liberal arts, to Orleans for the classics, to Salerno for medicine, to Toledo for magic. Yes, because contrarily to what your paranoid, again, anti-Christian has told you, throughout all the Middle Ages, astrology, any kind of what most of you call improperly occult, was always taught, right? But not hidden, high. No, it's just an improper way of thinking what it was. If you see it this way, literally was part of general disciplines. People were quite interested. Naturally, there were doubts on this stuff because not everybody's will see now was doing it for the right purpose, right? But what is extraordinary is that already by the 12th century there was this anxiety to update your curriculum basically in every field, right? The polymatic knowledge, the all-knowing, encompassing, is a thing that would last for a very long time until the great early modern libraries, the sense that knowledge could be dominated by a single person after all to a satisfactory extent. And when hyper-specialization, categorism, this sort of denial also necessarily necessarily, but unfortunately, going down that path of kind of not making a greater effort in relative terms, of fragmenting, hyper-specializing, separating all the disciplines and not making them talk anymore with one another, was a big deal. Was a qualifying feature of the world civilization in general, right at the time, in the West as in other areas of the world, the most advanced. So the concept here that the French monk was concluding with is that, albeit they moved from place to place, here they were not, however, learning a true, a true education, let's say, and the moral principles, which is already very fascinating, because already at the time, of course, the world was falling apart, right? It's always been falling apart, just was falling apart a bit less, by a bit smaller scale than nowadays. But the problem was there, right? It's something we've seen in every civilizational boom, right? We've seen it with the internet recently. That is to say, polities, culture, law, regulations cannot adapt immediately to the new means, the new media. And thus this creates also dangerous situations. The 12th century is also the century of the great heresies. And so of an uncontrolled and unscrupulous and unprejudiced approach to knowledge that, however, could be harmful as if properly uncontrolled. So there is an entire playlist, as you know, that I made about heresies and heterodoxy and so on. So you can look at what happened to the not so lovely Cathars, telling you the truth, due to the following this kind of ideas, because they turned political and violent pretty quickly, and for appalling reasons that you wouldn't probably even, if you follow me, realizing to be dramatically closer to the threat that has always undermined civilization as such. So sort of moral relativism, communistic directions, sort of gnostic heresies, this kind of idea of can simply take a shortcut and not really cultivating your own full psychophysical capacity to deal with the world, and just retreating from that safe spaces, literally with vegan diets. I'm not kidding, it was a major feature of Catharism. So all things that we've already seen, and at least in a positive sense, given that civilization is still standing, but of course with all the problems it has, say that still somebody has kept it together against this kind of mental disorders, pretty, if not autoimmune diseases properly, has succeeded by a degree. And of course, I don't need to say who did this, but as you know, I'm a great fan of universal power. In any case, this was an explanation, and it's also kind of fascinating, right? Again, it's difficult to understand fully, at least the bitterness against these experiences, if you don't contextualize again the dramatic conflicts arising from philosophical, theological disputes, the fact that new texts were coming about. People went really very far, again, to study this stuff, but it had existed since ever. We mentioned Toledo, for example, and that was a center of irradiation of an enormous amount of science, of various philosophies mediated from the Muslim world. In fact, even before the city, like at this point, was reconquered by the Christians. But people went there, also in Muslim times, to literally search for books. The same happened in the Levant. There wasn't a passive kind of reception. This is what we've been told by a quite, hysterically leftistic ideology, which, the West was somehow reactivated by some manuscript that was traveling from the East, because, before Latin Germanic Europe were just a bunch of barbarians that didn't understand anything. The most, of course, updated and serious historiography tells a completely different story. There was a dramatically expansive capacity, which was already basically at the same levels of the Byzantine Islamic civilizations, and that actually, especially by the 12th century, had already turned the tides notoriously in so many fields. Just the trade balance, technologically, etc. And the Westerners went specifically, right, to search for works they already knew existing, and because they needed to complete some treatises, some manuals that had already began to write, to experiment on, materially speaking, because we see also very often just about the scientific technological part, the written proofs, right? But archaeologically, we also know, say, that, military machinery, that the cathedrals, but we know these things were built without too much of a, of course, it was a lot of that kind of also theoretical insight, philosophy, science. We have lost kind of the sense even of what those things really meant traditionally, architectonically, for example. And that's why I have to make more videos about this. But we ignore the fact that it was, just like for the Renaissance, by the way, a huge, like that's only the tip of the iceberg. It was a hugely submerged world of practice that by far and by scale outweighed the theoretical one. Except about that we haven't found much written stuff, because most people wouldn't even need to technically write or know how to read or much to make the thing happen, right? So we should, of course, understand also how technology works a little, and philosophy of science and economics to appreciate to the fullest this concept. However, just when we look at the ecclesiastical dimension, that's an important part, all right, and there would be a lot to say about after this French monk statement, because, for example, in the 13th century, when the mendicant orders were created, the Pope specifically actually ordered them, on their own request, by the way, to send these people being educated to universities. They couldn't make such huge systems like the Franciscan or the Dominican order work without a very high education that the mendicants would actually come to the top of as scholars in the medieval universities afterwards as well. So there was probably also an institutional movement of clergy, of friars, etc. However, again, it's obvious that the university phenomenon, as we were saying before, was mostly a lay thing, right? And that's the thing that literally at least mirrors the booming of that more secular dimension on which also the church relied. Because cultural restlessness is not everything, right? Intellect, curiosity, thirst of knowledge, they're all there. Remember that there has never been historically, not even during the Enlightenment, a thirstier man of knowledge as the medieval one, right? And so with an inexhaustible thirst of knowledge that today we cannot probably even afford to understand, and of course that we don't have even remotely close. Our thirst of knowledge is to the minimum of historical levels. There is no doubt about this, but also brutally and radically and traumatically so. We are basically considering the world that surrounds us in relative terms the single most radically under-schooled, not just under-educated or culturally underdeveloped, but properly and incapably instructed men that have ever lived on Earth. So there is also that love, say, of knowledge for the sake of knowledge that especially young people experience, that is precious at that point. But it's not. There was actually a very sound, rational, cold, and practical reason why, of course, students were on the move, and they, in order to reach the studia and starting a career, an education in that field, right? The aforementioned Authentica Habita by the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of 1155, describing the students of the Bolognese studium, that came also from abroad, by the way, in large numbers, that is described, that speaks of them as individuals that they make themselves voluntary exiles for the love of science, right? This is an extraordinary statement worth of, in fact, of Holy Roman Emperor as such, and without too much romanticism. I mean, in part, it was true, right? Because, of course, also science was understood in a much deeper and essential constitutive way than we understand knowledge, science, and the reflection on the method to build in order to expand our knowledge really is. Right, so it's still understandable that it was not only, and or even probably prevalently, the pure love for knowledge that moved medieval students. The main deal, of course, of civilization is that in order to make it work, you need people who know how to make it work, who acquire the capacity to hold the pillar, let's say, and that must be invested in accordingly in order to make them succeed. Right. So obviously there was room for a career of substantial importance. Knowledge costs much more than today, right? So for millennia we have strived to be able to even read, to have a future, and everybody understood this. Today we have basically all the possible knowledge we can even dream to conceive, to be able to learn in infinite lives, one click away, and nobody gives a damn anymore, which should give the scale of really the difference between us and people living 1,000 years ago. And as I always say, don't make the childish mistake to think that you are a better human being than a person who lived 1,000 years ago. But first of all, because you just are not, and you're perfectly aware of that. And secondly, no, you're not by far, but I mean by very far, nor more intelligent, nor more capable than a person living 1,000 years ago. And especially, you will never be. So that there is nothing that you can do to make that happen. Not even if you spend your entire life accordingly, because simply you do not have the context for it, right? Which serves also for the purpose of everybody trying to, to simulate the past, to have this kind of. It does not exist in that way. The closest to get there is studying history, but it's also the best way to make you understand that you will never reach them. And it's quite of a lesson, especially if you just saw what the programs of these people at university actually were, and what you can't do, right? Always with a freaking phone in your hand, distracting yourself every 5 seconds. Now, if you look at, for example, the University of Bologna, the students there were not flocking much for things like pure cultural restlessness or uninterested love for knowledge, but because they were legitimately pushed by their future expectations regarding the so-called lucrative science that were specifically low, as we've said, and Bologna was the most important university in Europe throughout all the Middle Ages, to say the least, and medicine as well, but especially again low, because those who knew low, as the English satirical poet of the time, Nigellus Viraker, wrote, quote, can essentially cause arguments, and thus making somebody earn from that, then recomposing those quarrels and earning from that, and to revive the same arguments and earning yet more, right? This is naturally the crude opinion that we somehow have maintained about lawyers in general. There is something to it, but at the same time, there is also a lot of civilization behind that, and law is crucial for you. Can't really study, say, the Middle Ages, for example, without studying history of medieval law, right? Or properly understanding that, because I'm not talking about general kind of, little notes about, I don't know, here happened this, here happened that. No, you have properly to enter the technicalities of the medieval juridical science, which I also created a medieval law series for, that we will be updating also likely soon again in the next chapter in a few days. But besides the brilliant juridical careers, there were also many other paths of, in fact, work, social promotion, both in the field of the civilian world, lay world, let's say, and in the ecclesiastical one, right? For those who studied, for example, law in Bologna, but from the 13th century, also in Padua, in Naples, or elsewhere, we can make some simple example about this. Already from the beginning of the 13th century, the Bolognese commune obliged in its own tribunals only those judges that would have attended a university course of studies of at least 5 years. There are, yes, straight connections with the number of years we have remained universities nowadays for masters. Kind of, that's another story. It's not so linear, but there is something to it. If you look also at, for example, the University of Treviso in 1227, because, by the way, all these universities were born, that Universitas was the name that any guild, any association, any community had in the Middle Ages. Everything was a university, because Universitas means, something that is all aiming towards the same direction. So, freedom of ideas, my eyes. The obvious meaning was that there was a traditional objectivity about the truth and knowledge that, of course, the stronger, the more that is universally, in fact, gotten, and the stronger the local community is going to become, right? So here, naturally, they reasoned in a quite, socially speaking, organic, hierarchical way. This is where all universities forming the kind of the bigger body of the empire, of the universe, in a corporatist sense. But each one of these universities had a constitution, which prescribes quite specific course of studies, right? In the same the communes, because in the commune of Treviso, you were obliged fundamentally to access some administrative office only if you had attended one studium. It may not be a specific one, even just a local one, for at least 4 years. Right, so this is important because we're talking about administrative offices. It doesn't mean you had to become a doctor, a scholar, whatever. It's just that they wanted skilled personnel of people who had been studying and could certify, in fact, that in for a certain amount of years at university. Right, so you understand that all those new jobs were being created during the development of the local city-states, their administrative apparatus, etc., were selected increasingly on the base of such university education. In 1236, the Council of Tours fixed at least 3 years of mandatory learning of canon law. The French were a bit more theologically versed, as opposed to the juridically minded Italians. Here, however, for the lawyers operating in the ecclesiastical tribunals, right? Paris, Orléans, Tours, they had very, very important universities. Also, as far as theology, canon law, etc., was connected. was concerned. So if you look at, these are just a few examples, but at the rest of universities in Europe, they all followed practically this standard. You had, in order to be hired in a substantially prestigious place, you had to have studied at university for a certain amount of years, and the specialty that was required according to the task. We're talking about tribunals, both, say, here we're seeing communal, ecclesiastical ones. We're talking about, again, places of great power, right? If you control the sentences, you could control a big deal of local politics in these environments, in these communities. So needless to say, the world was very different from nowadays. In ancient or medieval times, there was nowhere such thing like juridical equality for anyone. Mostly was those who could pay for lawyers, etc., that would even just, say, appeal to the pertinent authorities to have their rights respected. But of course this could be done by communities entirely. And so when you look at the same wars were being fought at this time, I don't know, the communes versus the emperor, etc., you realize that the implication of the juridical implication of these actions was quite high, because there was a very different view of, say, imperial policy, royal policy behind it. Plus lots of other risks. Again, before there was this complaint that students went for, so much knowledge that they were unchecked in that, and nobody controlled their moral standards, and they could be hired in so many different fields, by the way. And it was understood that this was done for lucrative purposes. It was, as we've seen, the term lucrative sciences, because they were known as, if you study that, you can make money with it. Chiefly, again, law and medicine, which were also just a starting point, right? Because you could simply, as we've seen, not have become necessarily a scholar or a doctor, but still in that environment you could have kept working and obtaining quite lavish income, honors, so much so that in France during the 12th century there was this dictum which sounded in French like Bologne, la crasse en crasse, which means, speaking of Bologna, it was that she was fat and she was becoming fatter, because it was full of jurists that were becoming ever more prized, and this was known also across the Alps. But before becoming fat, however, of course, the medieval student had to cope with a substantial amount of difficulties and problems of various kinds. So obviously, why were these say occupations and studies so remunerative? Because they were also not easy, right? People went there because they actually mastered their own off, right? They it was an incredibly also expensive adventure, so not everybody succeeded, and it was a big deal, right, to even just have studied at university in the first place. The first obstacle was, of course, moral. If you want, of psychological nature. You naturally had to want this in the first place. I mean, there are some great figures, medieval history, artists, literates. Think about Petrarch, that were obliged, by the way, by their family to study at university, to become lawyers specifically. But they didn't like that, right? And so, in that case, as soon as Petrarch's father died, he turned to the letters, to poetry, and at least fortunately for Western civilization, and making a lot of money also in that world as a clergyman, though with a salary connection. So we're talking, as we will see now, whoever studied at university, medieval times, already had a consistent amount of money on their own, right? They had houses, lands, right? So you wouldn't find poor people going to study at university. Paradoxically, it was much easier to receive kind of a standard education in early medieval times, considering at least the average of quality as it increased, than later. Society was becoming ever more stratified, structured, hierarchical. The various estates had their own specific place, and things would eventually crystallize by the 14th century. Further, during the Ancien regime, it was basically like that. We made lots of videos explaining this. In any case, let's look at the difficulties that could arise for these students, because again, most of these people came already. Of course, you had to be educated before going to university in the first place. You would study in primary and middle schools, right? Mostly in religious schools, because they were, at least for studying at this level, the only profitable ones. Then, of course, there were lots of other schools of, think about the apprenticeship in shops, and if you were more leaning towards technical realities. I made videos about medieval military engineers and how rich they could become sometimes, but it was a bit of a dirtier path, and a less remunerative one than for those who had instead the money to provide with an adequate education to their children in these institutions and so on. The other opportunity was, of course, to even the more expensive one of having been taught by a private teacher, private master, in your own town, your own city. And after the conclusion of this path, to the youth and his family, their family, was presented this great dilemma, right? If sending the children to whether making them attempt or not the university adventure. Again, it was a big deal because it cost a lot, and it was not easy to succeed. It entailed you would essentially let your son going out there in the world without any precise, often at least without any specific support. Naturally, things could be easier if you again, there were just the functionality of settlements and wealth distribution. I mean, the richest people were already in the most important centers, so they were more likely to be close to a center of learning, right? So this is kind of obvious. I mean, still today, it is concretely the case. However, it was still, again, a huge commitment. Just think about loan debts today in also very advanced countries like, say, United States, etc. So you would think about that. So how to decide, right? So the traditionalists, also the conformists by a degree, those who feared God, were mostly pointing at the fact that this warning of their children of the danger connected with probably the long travels that again would send most of these kids that aged, however, earlier than today, right? And that also were habituated to a somehow more brutal world already from a psychological point of view. They were tougher. But again, not much for the crimes. We will make a video actually about the travel proper, physically speaking, because that was a huge deal. But mostly for what would happen when they would have arrived and even installed themselves wherever they were to study. Because there was, again, a moral issue behind this all, that especially the youth has, in part, to be exposed to, but in part to be also warned of course, given that they would have met with all the possible vices you could imagine when you entered university cities, right? we have seen again in that video about medieval university student violence and pastime, what could concretely happen were real battles taking place. In these battles, very often universities were striving also to emancipate themselves from the same local communes. There were secessions. It all went, as we've seen, hand in hand with new theories, new current, let's say, separations, let's say, due to ideological reasons of these groups. Also because the university was fundamentally sustained by the same student base, right? So the students entered the university with a sense of not necessarily of entitlement, because he had to undergo a sort of initiatory rite of some sort, and just eventually rising to the light at the end of the journey in a kind of Goliardic way. But the political autonomy of the university, made up by the masters and the students, was a huge deal, especially in the early days, right? And even in later times, when universities became much more kind of crystallized, prestigious, institutionalized, framed within the ancient regime, still quite respected in their original traditions, because it was felt like today that science, that education should be really free. I mean, the concept of the liberal arts is also to provide properly a liberty, a sense of autonomy that can make the man truly free in his choices, right? As a citizen, also as a subject, as a man of conscience, right? Because it doesn't stop to just claiming to have faith, right? You have to cultivate yourself further to some degrees that are God's path and will, right? So again, it's very difficult sometimes to approach a medieval mindset. We can do our best just to always fail, but there were all these considerations within. And there are some anecdotes regarding the vices that were, we can see from different sources. For example, the Dominican Jacques de Vitry, died in 1240, described Paris in her youth, that is to say, as a scabious goat, corrupted with the example, ruining many of the youth that flowed in her from every side. The simple fornication was not reputed at all a sin, right? Everywhere publicly, close to their brothels, the prostitutes attracted almost with violence the students that strolled by the streets and the squares of the city. And if there were students that just wouldn't want to go in, the prostitutes, with a loud voice, called them and told them from behind, calling them from behind sodomites. This is quite interesting, because naturally a Dominican was surely more sensitive to moral issues than the average medieval university student. But just consider the Dominicans as the mendicant orders we've seen themselves often attended the same universities, and they had been created as orders properly to operate in the cities. Again, made lots of videos. Also, I have a playlist about the mendicant orders, the Dominicans, the Franciscans also separately, if I'm not wrong. A playlist each. But they were still, however, called to regulate morals within the city, mostly for problems of heresy, as you know. But this other issues seemed seemed relevant because they had still a function to surveil the moral behavior of the people. This like medieval cities are just even if you study, I don't know, more recent sources before industrialization, right? We know pretty well what, I don't know, a city of the 17th century looked like in some detail. The sheer misery of the world at the time, of course, makes you reflect on how important these students also were felt to be, like if there was such concern from, in fact, towards them at all, right? There were naturally many concerns in the first place about lots of issues happening in the world that were naturally also more important. But it was believed legitimately that morals started literally from anyone, that there is a sacredness in human life as in its potential, for which just setting these standards when sending, again, this kids to study at university would have immediately corrupted them. Naturally, there is all a degree of, again, trial, test, initiatory experience. I don't know, a lawyer has to be a man of the world by many ways. So, again, it's difficult in a world at the time with abuses, violence, traumas of any kind to actually discern whether words like the one of Jacques de Vitry are just, moralistic rant, or there was a broader consideration. Probably was both, right? Because after all, we would be concerned about that still today, by a degree, aside from the most pushy, amoral and immoral leftistic, Marxistic perversions. Of course, families and society, generally speaking, is concerned, or say that the moral well-being of their pupils. But it's a beautiful picture. Consider again that Paris here was hosted the most important theological studium in Europe, right? So also for the standards of the Capetian monarchy, the sainthood revolving around the imperial identity of the French sovereigns, made plenty of videos about this topic since Merovingian times. There was a sense that as low, of course, as the lowest of society could be, even just the corruption of the city was excessive by a degree. But this is again also how civilization is made. You must have two strong contrasts, right? Two strong extremes to make a civilization really work hard and well. It's also interesting how you see sodomite at the time, of course, meant something less explicit, more figurate than what we use it like today. But it's fascinating, if true, that these prostitutes would be angry at the point of calling these guys sodomites in a world which the idea of Sodom was a more comprehensive idea of corruption, right? So even the sense that it was naturally to have sex, to have fun, by a degree, just as I think about the anxiety, sure, it was maybe even surely a sexual appeal in going away from your world, from your family, whatever, and just spending part of your money with for women and so on. But it's still interesting that even the prostitutes maintain a traditional idea of what a sodomite must not be in the first place, which kind of it's somehow satisfying to read. In any case, of course, I will be accused of fierce, how they call homophobia, of course. But that's not the point I was making, by the way. In any case, another obstacle, as we were pointed out, was financially in nature. As we were saying before, it cost a lot. Really, this was the most important. I mean, again, morally speaking, we see today there are some young people that start universities, can't make it. They feel torn by that, also because of the money. I remember, for example, I never had that kind of sense, but when I bail out of economics after the first 6 months at the very beginning, before studying history and having tried other things before, I felt like, a bit torn, because I knew I didn't like it there. It was kind of interesting and all, but I knew I wanted to do something else. So paying with the means of the time, again, people didn't have the disgusting amount of overbearing surplus in which we live today, in fatly and morbidly obesely rich societies, even among the poorest strata of the population. At the time, really, a father would invest maybe his life fortune to have his son learning at university. This was a huge deal, indeed, and given that the cost of the maintenance, because they had to live there, right? They had to pay the rent and all, right? And so for these long years, in faraway cities that were also quite priced, as I understand, because it costs a lot to live in Paris, as opposed to, a provincial town in France or wherever. But there was a sense that, of course, this was worth it. The resident costs naturally were overpriced, overloaded, so that local authorities had to intervene. The one of books, just the other day we were talking about the cost of manuscripts, and there was all a system to copy the books without literally copying the entire manuscript. They had all certain kind of papers put together. There were probably some certified bookkeepers that had to, in fact, ensure the books that the students wanted to copy, because they couldn't afford to buy the entire book. At least the majority of them had to be the certified ones from the masters of the university. There hadn't to be more than other copies around, because this knowledge was also maintained in somehow a secret way. They didn't want other people to pick these books and teach somewhere else. And so damaging the university. So there were all these kind of huge masses behind that. Considering, again, you have to study the entire Roman law and beyond, all the feudal law and other customary laws and so on. And you have to do this all with sheets of papers that you have to wait for to go there, to pay fund to compose. I mean, it's a mess, right? I got crazy if I didn't have everything just in a few sheets, let's say. Think about learning by heart all that stuff with the means of the time. You have to write this, right? Also, the bookkeepers had to literally have the time to copy that. They had to increase their numbers. They had their own timing again, and all had to be registered with the means of the time. So again, we will talk about this at some other point, because I studied that in codicology, etc. But there was a huge work, also a huge source of income for this. For example, workers and so on, etc. Were people cleaning the rooms. It was a huge business, right? So, as we were saying before, even just coming from the middle class, if we can speak of such a thing, was brought a lot of difficulties to actually enter in a university, right? Usually it was mostly religious orders that could provide with some educational opportunities, kids that had joined from poor backgrounds, right? They were gifted in a way, they were within the community, so they were kind of different from say people outside, so they would just manage the thing themselves. But at that point they knew that they were already within a religious career in the first place, right? There was also a problem because some places were paid already, others not, so it depended really on the connections, etc. Sometimes poor people that wanted to learn anyway used to accompany as serfs their rich connationals during the travels. But in general, the poor student that we find in the documents is not, so the poorest person that could study was definitely not born poor, right? He may have actually become so in the meanwhile for many reasons. There were accidents, excessive expenses, gambling, because that was a thing. Also, to, let's say, you don't have the money, let's try to play, to try to win that in some way, and getting even poorer, however, most of the time. Not so. All a huge pressure to participate to a system that was evidently seen as such a big deal that you would have also invested these huge sums in time and energies and whatever, with all the possible difficulties of the time, illnesses, etc., to just go for it, right? So we will probably see all this stuff better in some other video, because there is really a lot regarding, again, the travel, the problem of banally of the rent, but where to eat, how to clothe yourself, the general expenses for learning that are worth considering in a more comprehensive way. So this video may explain, generally speaking, why and with which expectation people would want to go study, mostly abroad, and or the abroad was just to another region, not even a different country at the time. And so starting a completely different life, very often not knowing much about what they would have found, if they would have succeeded. And it takes a lot of determination, definitely, right? So today we just feel this very mildly, for how much it can be felt, right? At least it's nothing compared to what people underwent at the time. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.